twin girls came and said, "We heard you're looking for a man on the ranch. Our dad loves you." Oklahoma, autumn 1892. Heavy clouds pressed low over the prairie, and the wind stripped the last leaves from the elms. At Martha Hayes' farm, the sharp ring of a hammer on wood had only just stopped when 3 quick knocks sounded at the door. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened it, then froze. 2 twin girls, no more than 7, stood in the gray light. Their coats were thin, their cheeks raw from the wind. One, the braver of the 2, lifted her chin and spoke with a steadiness that didn't match her small frame. "We heard you needed a man on the ranch. Our papa loves you." For a moment Martha simply stared. The wind caught the girls' hair and tugged it across their faces. Behind them, the fields stretched empty, the sky already threatening rain. Whoever they were, they had come a long way, and whatever their reason, it was certain to turn Martha's quiet, lonely life inside out. Martha had lived alone for nearly 3 years, after Thomas was killed at the county fair, trying, foolishly, to stop 2 drunken men from carving each other up. She had kept the farm alive through sheer stubbornness. That first winter she mended fences in freezing rain, drove the cattle in storms until the skin on her hands cracked and bled, and harvested oats by lamplight when the sun fell too soon. Every supper was eaten alone, the only sound the pop of wood in the stove and the wind moving across the empty land. She went to town as little as possible. People there looked at her in ways she could not stand. Some with pity, others with that sly glimmer in their eyes, as though a woman without a man was fair game. The mercantile, the post office, the bank, they were stops to be made quickly, with no lingering. So when the twins stood before her that afternoon, their breath clouding in the chill, Martha's first instinct was to tell them to go home. But she saw, even before they spoke again, that they had no home near enough to reach before the weather turned. The bolder one said her name was Lily. The quieter one, who stayed close to her sister's arm, was Nora. Their boots were wet through. Their wool gloves, mismatched and full of holes, trembled from cold. Lily explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that their father was working a cattle drive by the river and couldn't come himself, so they had come in his place. "Your place is not walking miles in weather like this," Martha said sharply. The girls exchanged a look, as if weighing whether to say more. Then Martha noticed the bruise on Lily's knuckles, the bluish cast to Nora's lips. Whatever pride she felt about keeping to herself crumbled under the sight. "Come in," she said, stepping back. Inside, the twins stood near the stove, soaking in its heat. They unwrapped scarves stiff with frost and accepted mugs of hot milk without a word of complaint. Nora drank hers slowly. Lily swallowed hers in quick gulps, as though afraid it might be taken away. By evening the wind had shifted, bringing with it a sting of sleet. Martha fixed them a supper of biscuits and beans and bedded them down under heavy quilts in the small room off the kitchen. She told herself she would send them back in the morning, walk them to the road and point them toward town, or toward the cattle drive if it was close. But when she looked in on them before blowing out her lamp, she found both asleep, cheeks flushed with warmth, their small hands curled in the blankets like kittens. It was near dusk the next day when a shadow darkened the porch. A man's voice called her name, low and certain. Martha opened the door to find a tall figure standing in the cold, a dusted hat in one hand and a sack slung over his shoulder. "William Collins," he said. His face was lean and weathered, his gaze steady in a way that made her wary. "I believe you met my girls." Before she could answer, Lily and Nora came running from the back of the house, colliding into his legs. He dropped the sack onto her table, cornmeal, a jar of honey, a wrapped loaf of bread. "For taking them in," he said simply. She expected him to linger, to explain why he'd sent them or what kind of man entrusted children to walk alone through bitter wind. But he touched his hat and left as quietly as he'd come. In the days that followed, small changes began appearing on the farm. The old well, which she'd been meaning to fix since summer, was suddenly reinforced with new boards. The hinges on the south gate stopped creaking. Fresh straw appeared in the stalls before she went out to feed the cattle. When she asked the girls about it, they only shrugged. They came often after that, sometimes with a few eggs, sometimes with nothing but their chatter. Lily liked to talk while she worked, about the color of the sky that morning, about a fox she'd seen near the creek, about the horse she wanted someday. Nora was quieter, but her eyes followed everything Martha did, as if memorizing each task. Martha found herself looking forward to their visits in a way that unsettled her. She had built her life on the belief that solitude was safer, that it kept her from wanting things she could not have. But the sound of their voices in the kitchen, the sight of their small boots by the door, it was dangerous how easily it began to feel like something she'd been missing for years. Then, one gray morning at the Lawsonville market, trouble began to stir. She was choosing sacks of feed when Ray Martin, half drunk and full of spite, stepped into her path. "Didn't know you liked company these days," he said, his grin showing the gap where a tooth had been knocked out in a fight. "Heard you got yourself a regular visitor. Tall fellow. Brings his girls around. Guess you don't spend the winter nights alone anymore." Huh. The words were loud enough to draw a few curious glances. Martha felt the heat rise in her face, but before she could answer, a shadow moved in beside her. William Collins stood there, hands loose at his sides but his eyes cold as river ice. "Walk away, Ray," he said quietly. Ray's grin faltered. "You threatening me, Collins?" "I'm warning you," William replied, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "Next time you open your mouth about her, you might not have all your teeth to speak with." Ray muttered something and backed off, but his eyes promised it wasn't over. It wasn't. 2 nights later, an envelope slid under Martha's door. Inside was a scrap of paper with words scrawled in charcoal. Filthy threats that made her skin crawl. She burned it without showing the girls, telling herself it was nothing. But the next evening, Lily and Nora came running from the barn, their faces pale. "Someone's out there," Lily whispered. William happened to be nearby, repairing a fence post. He caught the man before he could get away. It was Ray. Dragging him to the main street, William forced him to read one of his own letters aloud before the sheriff. Ray spent the night in a cell. A week later, the hay barn went up in flames. Martha and William fought the fire until the beams collapsed into black ruin. In the wet ash, William found boot prints and the smell of kerosene. The trail led straight to the ranch of Henry Black, a man who had wanted Martha's land for years. The plan formed as quickly as the storm clouds outside. Tobias pointed to the far side of the barn. "That's the low path. Mud's already ankle-deep there. Perfect for caltrops. They'll send flanking riders that way, thinking it's faster." Ayanna nodded, her eyes sharp. "And the tripwires?" "In the mesquite line. Any man who breaks through will be half-blind from rain and firelight. They'll never see them." He handed her a bundle of iron spikes, the edges wicked even in the dim firelight. "Plant these where the ground looks solid but isn't. Horses will go down hard. Men will panic." The women moved without hesitation, splitting into pairs, each armed with weapons they'd hidden under rags. Tobias could tell from the precision of their movements that this wasn't their first ambush. Lightning forked across the sky, turning the yard white for an instant, and in that flash, Tobias saw the enemy. Shapes moving along the ridge, riders dismounting, torches bobbing in the dark. The baby's cry came again, closer now, tugging at him like a hook in his chest. He caught Ayanna watching him. "You'll go for the child," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he answered, "but I'll need cover. And if I don't come back." "You will," she interrupted, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Because I do not intend to fight my way out of this alone." Tobias almost smiled. In another life, he might have liked her. In this one, they had no time for anything but survival. The first shot cracked through the rain, a warning meant to rattle them. Tobias ducked low, moving along the shadows of his own house until he reached the storage shed. Inside, he grabbed a coil of rope, a hunting knife, and a battered revolver that still held 6 rounds from a lifetime ago. From the yard came the sound of confusion. Shouts, curses, a horse screaming in pain. The caltrops had done their work. Tobias took the opening and slipped along the fence line, his boots sinking into the sucking mud. He found the child near the wagon track, wrapped in a sodden blanket and tied to the saddle of a soldier's horse. The man stood nearby, rifle in hand, his attention fixed on the chaos back at the ranch. Tobias moved like a shadow until he was behind him. One hand clamped over the soldier's mouth. The other drove the knife home under his ribs. The man sagged, dead before he hit the mud. The baby was heavier than he expected, warm against his chest despite the cold. Tobias whispered a reassurance. He wasn't sure the child understood and turned back toward the house. Halfway there, a gunshot split the night, and something hot and sharp burned across his shoulder. He hit the ground, rolling into the ditch as another bullet hissed past. 2 soldiers were closing in, their boots splashing through the waterlogged earth. Tobias laid the baby in the lee of a fallen fence post, whispered, "Stay quiet," and drew the revolver. The first soldier went down with a shot to the knee. The second fired wildly, missing in the dark. Tobias closed the distance and ended it with the butt of the revolver. By the time he reached the house again, the fight had spread into the yard. Ayana's women moved like a tide, appearing and vanishing between flashes of lightning, cutting men down before they could raise an alarm. Tobias passed the child to the youngest woman, who vanished into the back with barely a nod. "Morrison's second is still out there," Ayana said, materializing beside him. "He's rallying them. Then we break them before he does." They pushed into the fray together. Tobias's rifle barked once, twice, each shot finding a target. Ayana's blade flashed in the firelight, precise and merciless. Around them, the ranch that had been Tobias's refuge for 8 years became a killing ground. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire faltered. The surviving soldiers were pulling back, dragging their wounded, retreating toward the ridge. Rain hissed on the torches they abandoned in the mud. Tobias stood panting in the yard, shoulder throbbing, rain mixing with blood down his arm. Ayana approached, her face unreadable. "They'll be back," she said simply. "Not tonight," Tobias replied. "They've lost too many. And they know now that this isn't just a ranch full of women." The women began gathering what they could carry. Food, blankets, weapons stripped from the dead. The baby slept again, bundled dry in a shawl. Tobias looked at the bodies strewn across his land and felt no triumph, only the heavy knowledge that his life here was over. The army wouldn't forgive this. They would come in force next time, and no caltrops or tripwires would stop them. Ayana seemed to read his thoughts. "There is a place," she said, "far to the west. The council will meet there in 2 days. If I arrive with this child, and with the proof of what Morrison has done, they will listen. And they will protect you." He studied her, wondering if protection from one enemy just meant binding himself to another. But he had made his choice when he opened his door that night. The storm broke near dawn, leaving the land shrouded in mist. Tobias saddled 2 horses, his movements mechanical, not allowing himself to think about what he was leaving behind. Ayana mounted without a word. The others waited, their faces set. Tobias took one last look at the ranch, the well, the barn, the house that had been his tomb, and turned his back on it. They rode west. By midday, the sun burned through the clouds, revealing a land scrubbed clean by rain, and a trail behind them that would not stay hidden for long. Somewhere ahead lay the council, the truth, and maybe a chance at something Tobias hadn't dared hope for in years. But as he glanced at Ayana, riding with the baby cradled in her arms, he understood something else. The war wasn't over. It had only just found a new battlefield. The first day westward passed in a blur of hoofbeats and watchful silence. The air still carried the damp scent of last night's storm, but the sky was a hard, bright blue now, stretching unbroken over miles of open prairie. It was the kind of day that would have felt endless if not for the knowledge that they were being hunted. Tobias kept his gaze moving, scanning the ridgelines, the windbreaks of cottonwoods, the dips in the land where riders could wait unseen. Ayana rode beside him, the child swaddled and pressed close, her expression fixed and unreadable. Behind them, 3 of her women followed at a measured pace, each carrying weapons openly now. There was no point in pretending they were harmless travelers. Near midday, they came upon a dry arroyo and dismounted to water the horses from a shallow pool left by the rains. Tobias crouched beside the pool, cupping water in his hands, and felt the old itch between his shoulder blades, the one that had saved his life too many times to ignore. He turned his head slightly, enough to catch the faint glint of sunlight off metal on the far ridge. "Riders," he murmured. Ayana didn't look up. "How many?" "3 that I see. Maybe more holding back." Her jaw tightened. "Scouts. They're testing our pace, waiting to call in the rest." Tobias studied the ridge again. The riders weren't closing, just keeping parallel. They had time, but not much. "We'll push harder," Ayana said, standing. "If we make the Red Fork by nightfall, we can use the canyon to cover our trail." The afternoon became a long, grueling stretch of speed and silence. Dust rose behind them in thin, restless clouds. The scouts stayed at the edge of sight, patient as wolves. By sunset, the land began to dip, and Tobias saw the dark slash of the Red Fork Canyon ahead. They entered single file, the walls rising around them until the sky narrowed to a strip of deepening purple. Here, the sound of the horses' hooves echoed oddly, and the air cooled sharply. When they reached a bend where the canyon split, Ayana signaled for a halt. "We'll camp here," she said. "Small fire, only what's needed to heat water. The canyon muffles sound, but smoke will still carry." Tobias set about gathering kindling, listening as the others unrolled blankets and checked the child. The baby was quiet, but his small fists clenched and unclenched in his sleep, as if some part of him felt the tension pressing in on them. That night, Tobias couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat with his back to the canyon wall, rifle across his knees, eyes on the dark mouth of the trail they'd come through. The fire was nothing more than embers now, casting red glows that faded as quickly as they formed. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called high and lonely. Ayana came to sit beside him without a word. For a while they just listened to the wind scraping along the rock. "You've been watching me," she said finally. "I've been watching everyone," Tobias replied. Her mouth quirked at that. "And what have you decided?" "That you've been trained for this, moving people through country while being hunted. But you're carrying something heavier than just that child." Ayana's gaze drifted toward the sleeping bundle. "He's the chief's nephew. His mother was killed in the same ambush that wounded me. If the council sees him alive, it will prove the army's story is a lie. But he's more than proof, he's a future. Without him, the factions in my people will break apart. And war will come again." Tobias absorbed that in silence. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was trying to keep an entire people from shattering. "Then we'd better make sure he gets there," he said. Her eyes met his in the half-light, and for the first time since they'd met, he thought he saw something like trust there. By dawn they were moving again, the canyon twisting ahead in unpredictable turns. But at the third bend, Tobias spotted fresh tracks in the dust, boot prints alongside hoof marks. Someone had come this way before them and not long ago. He raised a hand to halt the column. "We're not alone in here." Ayana's women drew their rifles. The canyon walls suddenly felt too close, the shadows too deep. Tobias dismounted and moved ahead on foot, every step measured. Around the next turn, he saw the proof. A man slumped against the rock, his face pale and drawn, a blood-soaked bandage around his leg. The man lifted his head at the sound of boots on stone. "Help, please." Ayana joined Tobias, her eyes narrowing. "It's one of Morrison's men. Looks like he's been left behind," Tobias said. "Or planted," Ayana countered. The man's gaze flicked between them, desperate. "They left me to die. I know where they're waiting for you. Past the north bend. 50 men. His voice cracked. "Don't go that way." Tobias didn't move closer. "Why tell us?" "Because they'll kill me too, once they're done with you." Ayana studied him for a long moment. "If you're lying, you die now. If you're telling the truth, you might live to see another sunrise." He nodded quickly. "I swear it." In the end, they took his warning and his rifle. Tobias led them up a narrow side cut that climbed steeply toward the rim. It was slow, exhausting work, but when they finally reached the top, they could see the canyon floor below, and the truth in the soldiers' words. A company waited in the shadows, rifles ready, horses tied off. Tobias counted at least 40 men before the bend hid the rest. If they'd ridden straight in, it would have been a slaughter. Ayana's voice was low but firm. "We'll skirt them. There's an old mining road 2 miles west. It will cost us half a day, but it will keep us alive." The detour took them through rough country, broken rock, thorny scrub, and sudden drops that forced them to lead the horses. But by late afternoon, the land smoothed into rolling grass, and the mountains rose faintly on the horizon. They stopped at a spring to rest. The child stirred and opened dark, alert eyes, watching Tobias as if measuring him. He reached out one small hand, gripping Tobias's finger with surprising strength. Tobias felt something shift inside him, something he didn't want to name. But when he looked up, Ayana was already watching, and she gave the smallest nod, as if she'd seen it happen before he had. That night, they camped under a sky crowded with stars. The wind was soft here, carrying only the scent of sage. For the first time since they'd left, Tobias felt the weight in his chest ease, if only slightly. But just before sleep took him, he thought of the men in the canyon, waiting in vain for prey that would never come, and of the fact that men like that didn't give up. They would keep coming. And the fight for that child's life, and for the fragile peace Ayana carried, was far from over. The land changed as they drew closer to the council's meeting place. For days they had ridden through open prairie and canyon, every rise a risk, every shadow a possible threat. Now the ground softened into a broad valley, its floor braided with streams and meadows. Cottonwoods flared yellow along the water, and the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Ayana slowed her horse. "We're close. The council will already be gathered." Tobias glanced behind them. The scouts had vanished 2 days ago, but absence didn't mean safety. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments often came when the enemy seemed to have lost interest. They crested a low ridge and the camp came into view. A wide circle of lodges and canvas tents, smoke rising in thin streams. People moved through the spaces between, their voices a blend of different languages and dialects. Horses were staked in neat lines beyond the main ring. Ayana's women straightened in their saddles, the tension in their faces easing only slightly. The child stirred in her arms, then blinked at the sight below as if sensing its importance. At the camp's edge, a line of sentries stepped forward. They were armed, but their spears were held upright in greeting rather than challenge. One of them, an older man with white braids and eyes sharp as a hawk's, spoke first. "Ayana, you've come. And I've brought proof," she answered. Her gaze dropped briefly to the child in her arms. The sentries exchanged glances, then led them into the heart of the camp. Word spread quickly. Faces turned, murmurs followed. Tobias could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, measuring, judging. He kept his posture calm, his hand resting loosely on the saddle horn, though every instinct told him to be ready. The council lodge stood at the center. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of cedar. 7 elders sat in a half-circle, each marked by age, lineage, or reputation. Behind them hung banners embroidered with symbols Tobias didn't recognize. Ayana stepped forward, laying the sleeping child on a blanket in the center of the lodge. The murmurs grew louder. One of the elders leaned forward sharply. "This is Connie's son," Ayana said, "taken in the raid. His mother was killed. You were told they both died. You were told Morrison's men fought only warriors. That was a lie." A ripple of reaction passed through the half-circle. The oldest woman among them spoke, her voice slow but carrying. "And you have proof this was no battle, but a slaughter?" Ayana reached into her saddlebag and produced a packet, blood-stained, weathered from travel. She handed it to the woman, who unfolded it to reveal letters, orders signed in an unfamiliar hand, and a map marked with Morrison's seal. They targeted the settlement knowing women and children would be there. Ayana said. And they meant to use the child as a bargaining piece, or to let him die and claim our line was broken. The elders studied the evidence in silence. Tobias watched their faces, trying to read the shifting currents between them. Some looked furious, others wary. He knew politics when he saw it. Truth was rarely enough on its own. Finally, one of the men spoke. If we act on this, we risk war. Another answered sharply. If we do not act, we invite worse. Ayana looked from face to face. I did not come for war. I came to keep it from happening. But that will only be possible if we stand together, and if those who seek to profit from division are stopped. The discussion that followed was low-voiced but tense. Tobias shifted his weight, scanning the lodge for threats. It was then that he saw movement beyond the door, shadows that didn't belong to anyone inside. His hand went to the revolver at his side. Moments later, a sentry burst in, breathless. Riders approaching from the east. Soldiers, maybe 20. The elders looked to Ayana. They followed you, one said. Tobias stepped forward. They didn't follow. They knew where you'd be. Someone sent word. The air in the lodge tightened. Ayana's eyes flicked to her women, who were already moving toward the door. The elders murmured, voices urgent. The old woman who had spoken first rose to her feet. We will not let them take the child. But we will not fight here, not in the council grounds. Ayana's voice was steel. Then we'll meet them outside. Tobias followed her into the open. The valley seemed suddenly smaller, the ridges closer. Down the eastern slope, riders were coming fast. Morrison's men, their uniforms dulled by dust but unmistakable. Ayana turned to Tobias. You know the land. Can you slow them? He scanned the slope. There's a choke point at the ford. If we drop 2 trees across it, they'll have to dismount and clear the way. That buys us time. She nodded. Do it. The next minutes blurred into motion. Axes biting into wood. Shouts from the council camp as people moved the child to safety. Ayana's women taking up positions along the ridge. Tobias worked until his arms burned, and when the first tree fell with a crash into the ford, the soldiers were only 100 yards away. Gunfire cracked. Chips of rock and bark flew. Tobias dropped behind cover, reloading. Ayana's voice carried above the noise, sharp commands in her own tongue, answered by rifle shots that echoed off the valley walls. The soldiers tried to push through the ford, but the fallen trees and the withering fire from the ridge held them back. For long minutes it was a standoff, until one of Morrison's lieutenants signaled a retreat. The riders pulled back just out of range, regrouping on the far side. They're not leaving, Tobias said, wiping sweat and rain from his face. They'll wait us out. Ayana's gaze stayed fixed on the enemy. Then we'll outlast them. The standoff lasted into the night. Fires burned low on both sides, and the valley filled with the uneasy quiet of 2 forces measuring each other. In the council lodge, the elders made their decision. Morrison's orders would be sent to Allied settlements, and envoys dispatched to the territorial governor. By dawn, the soldiers were gone, leaving only churned mud and trampled grass. Whether they'd been called back or had decided the cost wasn't worth it, no one knew. Tobias stood at the ridge, watching the empty slope. He felt no triumph, only the knowledge that this was one battle in a longer war. Ayana joined him, the child still in her arms. You could leave now, she said quietly. Go back to your land. Start over. He shook his head. If I leave, they'll find you again. And maybe next time you won't have enough rifles or enough time. Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. Then stay. But know this, you're not just fighting for me or for him. You're fighting for something larger. And it will demand more than you think you can give. Tobias looked out over the valley, the distant peaks catching the first light of morning. Then I'll give it anyway. The valley woke slow the next morning, but not Tobias. He had been awake since before the first light bled into the sky, watching the mist lift from the grass and drift into the cottonwoods. The camp behind him was quiet save for the muffled sounds of people rising. Fires being stoked, water drawn, murmured greetings that carried the weight of a night survived without bloodshed. Ayana emerged from the lodge, the child still in her arms, his dark eyes blinking in the pale light. She walked with the steady grace of someone who would not allow fatigue to show, though Tobias guessed she had slept little more than he had. "They're gone," Tobias said. "For now," she replied. Her gaze swept the ridges. But Morrison's men do not leave a thing unfinished. He knew she was right. A retreat wasn't the same as defeat. The army had resources, reach, and an appetite for making examples. By mid-morning, the council had gathered again. The elders stood outside the lodge this time, the rising sun glinting off ornaments in their hair and the steel of the weapons they now wore openly. The old woman who had spoken for them before addressed the camp. "Word will be sent to all allies. Morrison's orders and his crimes will be carried to the governor. This is not war, not yet. But neither will we hide in silence. Our line is not broken, and the proof stands before you." She gestured to Ayana and the child. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, some voices sharp with anger, others low with worry. Tobias could feel the fault lines in the air, hope, fear, and the weight of choosing a side. Afterward, Ayana found him near the horse lines. "The council thanks you," she said. "I didn't do it for thanks," Tobias replied. "Then why?" He thought about that longer than he expected to. "Because too many times I stood by while someone else lost everything. This time I didn't." Her expression softened for a heartbeat before the steel returned. "You'll need to decide if you're staying. Once we move the child to a safer place, the road will get harder. Morrison will push. There will be no middle ground." That night, the camp grew still early. Tobias sat apart from the fires, watching the stars edge across the black. Every choice seemed clearer under a sky like that, sharp, simple, merciless. In the small hours, he heard the crunch of footsteps. Ayana lowered herself to the ground beside him, her breath visible in the cool air. "You're leaving," she said. "No," Tobias answered. "But I thought about it." She didn't press. They sat in silence until the horizon paled. 2 days later, the camp began to break apart. Lodges came down, horses were loaded. Small groups set out in different directions, each carrying messages, supplies, or the council's orders. Ayana's party was the last to leave. Tobias rode at her side, the child between them in a sling. Their path led into higher country. Pines thickening on the slopes, the air turning sharp. It was easier to hide a trail here, but the ground was rough and every mile took more from the horses. On the third evening, as they made camp near a stream, Tobias found Ayana studying a scrap of hide marked with charcoal lines. "What's that?" he asked. "Routes the scouts left us," she said. "Places we can shelter, places we must avoid." Her finger traced a winding path west. "Here, an old fort, abandoned since the last treaty. If we reach it, we'll have walls at our back for a night." They made it there by dusk the next day. The fort was little more than a stone shell, its gates long rotted, but it offered cover from the wind and a high vantage over the surrounding hills. Tobias took first watch. Hours passed in stillness, until a flicker of movement in the pines caught his eye. A man stepped into the open, hands raised. It was the wounded soldier they had found in the canyon. Ayana joined Tobias at the wall. "You followed us," she said flatly. "I've been running from them too," the man said. "Morrison's cut off his wounded before. I had nowhere else to go." Tobias studied him. "If you stay, you work. If you lie, you die. Understand?" The man nodded. They let him in. He ate like someone who hadn't seen a meal in days, then slept near the gate. Tobias didn't trust him, but he also knew the truth, that sometimes an enemy of your enemy was the best you could find. At dawn, they moved on. The land began to open again, and with it came the unease of exposure. Late that afternoon, Tobias spotted dust rising on the far horizon. He counted at least a dozen riders. "They've found us," Ayana said. The chase began in earnest. Miles blurred beneath the pounding of hooves. They took every dip and curve in the land to break sight, but the riders held on. By sunset, they reached a narrow gorge, a place Tobias had passed once before. "In there," he said. "It's a risk, but the walls will shield us from rifle fire. They plunged into the gorge, shadows swallowing them. The air cooled, and the sound of the horses echoed off the stone. Behind them, the riders entered, their shouts bouncing in strange directions. Half a mile in, Tobias spotted a fallen boulder that narrowed the path. He swung down, seized the rope from his saddle, and began dragging loose rock into a barricade. Ayana and her women joined him, the sound of hooves closing fast. By the time the soldiers reached them, the path was half blocked. Gunfire lit the shadows. Tobias returned fire, the sound deafening in the narrow space. One horse went down, tangling with the rider behind it. Shouts turned to curses. The standoff lasted until the sun's last light faded from the gorge mouth. Then, with no clear way through, the riders pulled back. They camped in the gorge that night, the walls rising black against the star-pierced sky. Tobias lay awake, listening to the child's slow breathing, knowing this was only a pause. In the morning, they would move again. The road ahead was long, and every mile carried the weight of what they had already risked. But Tobias no longer thought about turning back. The choice was made, and whatever storms came, he would ride into them, not away. The trial ended on a cold, dry morning that smelled faintly of pine tar and old paper. The courthouse windows shuddered under the wind, letting in brief fingers of cold that curled along the wooden floor. Martha sat straight-backed, her gloved hands folded in her lap, listening to the judge's voice carry each word with deliberate weight. Henry Black stood at the defendant's table, his skin ashen, his mouth drawn to a thin line. When the sentence was read, his gaze stayed fixed on the floorboards. Years in the territorial prison, his false land claim voided, compensation for the damages to be paid directly to her. On paper, it was a victory, but Martha felt none of the sweetness that word implied. She thought of the barn, once a proud frame of cedar and oak, now reduced to a blackened skeleton jutting from the frozen ground. She thought of cattle standing in the wind without cover, their breath steaming in the cold. Justice had arrived, but it came carrying its own cost. When she stepped out into the street, the air was brittle, the sky white as frost. William walked beside her as far as the corner where his horse was tied. The girls trailed behind him, quiet in their heavy coats. At the hitching post, he met her eyes, his face unreadable. "I'll see you again," he said, though his voice had the weight of someone speaking from a distance. He mounted, the girls climbing up behind him, and without another word, they rode east. The sound of their hooves faded into the wind, leaving only the creak of the signboard above the general store. Days passed. The ranch was not silent. There was the hammer of repairs, the steady groan of the pump, the shuffle of boots across hard earth, but it felt empty. Martha worked from first light to the edge of darkness, mending harness straps by lamplight until her eyes blurred. She sold 2 calves to pay for hay. She hauled water for the stock herself, the wind biting through her coat. Nights were long. She listened to the house shift in the cold, every pop of the timbers an echo in the stillness. Winter deepened. Ice glazed the troughs each morning. The north wind brought a haze of snow that stung her face and collected in the corners of the yard. She told herself she did not wait for him, but some mornings she found her eyes turning toward the road as if by their own accord. On the 13th morning after the trial, frost covered the ground in a pale sheen that crackled under her boots. She was halfway to the pump when she saw 3 riders on the far ridge, their shapes softened by the low light. They came slow, horses stepping steady through the thin crust of snow. William rode at the front, his coat dark against the pale horizon. On either side, Lily and Nora sat straight in their saddles, their cheeks flushed from the cold. When they reached the yard, the girls slid from their horses. Lily carried a twist of red yarn, wound tight into a circle. Nora held a small bundle of dried sage tied with twine. William stepped onto the porch. His face was weathered from travel, his eyes searching hers as though to measure the answer before it was given. "Martha," he began, his voice quiet but certain, "I've had enough of watching storms from far off. I'd rather meet them here with you." From his coat pocket, he drew a small velvet box, worn at the edges from years of being carried. Inside lay a simple silver ring, its surface dulled but catching the morning light in soft flashes. "I can't promise an easy life," he said, "but I can promise we'll face whatever comes together." The girls didn't wait for her reply. They crossed the porch and wrapped their arms around her waist. The warmth of their small bodies pressed through her coat, the scent of wind and wood smoke clinging to their hair. Her answer was a nod, a breath, the extension of her hand. William slid the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose, but it sat there as though it had always been meant to rest in that place. The rest of the day unfolded in the quiet rhythm of shared work. William repaired the corral gate while Martha fetched tools from the shed. The girls carried kindling to the house, their laughter darting like small birds across the yard. By late afternoon, the four of them stood together in the western field, planting the first rows of winter wheat. The earth was cold and stubborn, but it broke under their hands. Each seed was a small act of faith buried against the frost. The sun dropped low, painting the furrows in copper light. Wind moved across the land in slow, steady waves. It still carried the bite of winter, but it no longer felt as sharp. Martha looked out over the dark lines of turned soil disappearing into the dusk and felt something she had not in years, an understanding that, even here, a future could take root.